Health inspectors. What's the worst thing you've ever found when inspecting a restaurant? My stepdad used to be a baker in an authentic recreation of an 18th century New French fortress. Because they sell bread to the public, the health inspector came by and she was ripping into my stepdad for violations like the stonework walls, the doorless entranceways, or the lack of a mosquito zapper. He pointed out that they were following the highest standards, except for things that would destroy the authenticity of this 18th century bakery. The health inspector relented and agreed to give him a pass after verifying the food storage area was secure. They went to the shed, which was a doorless building attached to the bakery. As the health inspector went in, there happened to be an escaped cow licking all of the loaves. My stepdad could only say, "Honestly, this never happens." They passed the health inspection. Health inspector witnesses escaped farm animal licking all the bread in a bakery. Passes health inspection anyway. Commenter. A tuna canning plant in Los Angeles was off of Terminal Island. The processing plant owned the entire island a few miles offshore. Needless to say, had to take a boat to the plant to look at some machinery they needed repaired. We get to the plant, and there are dozens of cats inside the plant, outside the plant, warehouse, etc. Cats everywhere. Nobody said anything. They were even in the office building. After a few trips, I finally asked. One guy said in a joke, "It's either rats or cats. We don't have a rat problem here." Story 2. My favorite Chinese restaurant got shut down. My ex-wife worked for the city, and I asked her what was the deal. She said the health inspectors found something leaking from the ceiling. They lifted the ceiling tile and shined a flashlight and saw multiple eyes staring back at them. It was chickens. They were raising chickens in the ceiling, and chicken crap was dripping in the food that I had been eating at least once a week. Story 3. Not a health inspector, but heard this story through a guy who services my soft serve machines. As info, for those not in the ice cream business, most soft serve machines need to be cleaned, meaning fully disassembled, scrubbed, and sanitized, at least weekly, some every 3 days. He got a call from a woman complaining that the vanilla side of her machine was coming out with black specks in it, was worried it might be grinding up an O-ring or worse. He took the head off the machine and claims he nearly lost his lunch as the barrel was infested with banana roaches. Apparently, the woman had never cleaned the machine in the several months she had been open. Somehow, the roaches got into it. At night, the barrel stops freezing and just keeps the mix cool, so it returns to a liquid, and were being ground up and expelled as additional protein. How long has it been doing this? About a week. Commenter. My friend was inspecting a restaurant, walked out the back to find a man stirring a huge pot of curry, with his arm, no spoon or anything, just up to his hairy elbows in curry. Story 4. My stepmother is the lead health inspector for a decent-sized suburban town. While I have never asked what the worst thing she has witnessed as part of her job was, I do know of one instance that was pretty gross. A truck full of lobsters was traveling down the highway and crashed. The police came, and eventually, they towed the truck. As a Board of Health inspector, my stepmother was consulted to see if any of the lobsters were viable, and she told them no. The load is a total loss since there were literally lobsters scattered across the highway covered in dirt, sand, etc. Fast forward 24 HRs, and one of the restaurants in town ran a special. Twin lobsters for $19.99. Apparently, the owner of the trucking towing company knew the restaurant owner pretty well, so they made a deal whereby the restaurant would pay a very discounted price for the road lobsters. The restaurant would turn around and illegally serve the lobsters to unsuspecting customers or sell them out of a truck behind the restaurant. I'm not sure what the repercussions were, but I think they were shut down for like a week. They closed shortly thereafter, and now there's a new restaurant there. The towing company lost their contract to tow vehicles/semi-trucks with the town and state. Story 5. Not a health inspector, but worked in a restaurant where the managers were good friends with one. The coffee ice cream shop next door was shut down out of nowhere, and we were all shocked because they were pretty busy. Health inspector came in one day, and manager asked why it was shut down. Health inspector proceeded to tell my manager that he walked in unannounced early one morning before the shop opened, only to find the owner doing himself good behind the counter by the ice cream. Story 6. High-end Thai place in a popular tourist area. Go downstairs to the kitchen and open up their freezer. On the top shelf of the freezer, they are storing loose beef, pork, and chicken in 3 separate piles. The meats are not in any containers. They are all sitting on a large piece of cardboard the restaurant had placed on the bottom of the shelf. We poke the cardboard and our finger goes right through it. The juices from the 3 meats had turned the cardboard into pulp. We then notice it dripping from the combined sludge of chicken, pork, and beef blood. From the looks of the cardboard, it had been dripping for a while. We looked to the shelf below to see the results of the drip. Underneath the meats, in the shelf second from the top, the restaurant was storing 3 buckets of ice cream, without lids, directly under the meat drip. We look inside the ice cream containers and see congealed, partially frozen, cardboard-laced raw meat drippings pooled in the center of each tub of ice cream. None of the ice creams were more than halfway full. We asked the kitchen manager how long they've been storing their items like this. He doesn't remember, at least a few months. My theory is, because the place was A, nice restaurant, and B, an ethnic restaurant, patrons were less likely to complain about odd flavors. For example, instead of complaining about blood in the ice cream, wondering out loud if that taste is star anise. That's one of the few inspections that made me feel physically sick. Place still got an A because the restaurant grade system in my city is about as effective as TSA. Commenter: when I went to culinary school, one of professors made the statement, if you want to know how clean a restaurant's kitchen is, go to bathroom first, before you are seated. If the bathroom is dirty, there is a good chance the kitchen is in the same condition. Story 7. So many horrible Chinese restaurants in this thread, so I thought I'd give a shout out to the one I used to work at years ago. The owner was meticulous about cleanliness. Every night the kitchen staff would scrub the floor and everything else down with soap and hot water. The dishwasher ran so hot, you could see the steam rising and had to wait for them to cool down before you could touch them without burning your hands. That place was clean and served some of the best Chinese food. The owner eventually retired and sold his land. Boy, do I miss the hot and sour soup. Commenter: not a health inspector, but someone in my city repainted their floor with non-slip paint and literally painted over a dead rat, sealing it in there. And to top it off, it was in the middle of the kitchen, not under a bench or anything similar. Story 8. Did food safety inspection at a large slaughterhouse for a while. We did our own inspections each shift, and the government inspector stopped by once a day, too. One day, I came round a corner, and one of the workers who was running service for the butchers had dropped a ham on the floor. So the proper way to handle this for him was to leave it there and call for a re-inspector to come pick it up, take it out to carve off any contaminated bits, and rinse it in boiling water. Now, it relatively often happened meat was dropped on the floor. It's just very, very hard to avoid it when running in a factory setting with human labor. So this was common. What was uncommon was what the guy did. First, he tried catching it as it fell, which would have been fine. No contact with any surface, and he could have just thrown it back into the tub it had fallen out of. He didn't catch it, though, and it landed on the floor. Thinking that Noon was watching, he tried picking it up and dropped it again. He did this 3 times. So first and foremost, he's not supposed to be touching anything that's been on the floor. It cross-contaminates his hands, and he has nowhere to put the contaminated product anyway. But he did this 3 times and dropped it 3 times. Freshly carved hams can be slippery when wearing vinyl gloves. He then, out of pure frustrations, annoyance at the unwieldy ham, dropped down on all 4s and proceeded to pick up the raw, freshly cut 6-kilo ham by his teeth, stood up, ham dangling from his choppers, and dropped it into the tub with around 600 kilograms of product and drove off with the tub for processing. He was fired a few minutes after that, and the entire tub of product discarded. Story 9. Health inspector here. Here are my top 3. An old liquor store, which had once been the front unit of a housing duplex, had now converted into full-service deli, sandwiches, fried chicken, etc., without plan review, so they were severely lacking in all the proper space and equipment. Observed were rat infestation, droppings everywhere in the place, mountains of old cast-off equipment in the back, giving the rats a home, meat defrosting on the hood of an inoperable car on the side alley, back unit of duplex, now converted to food storage, had unfinished wooden boards on the floor, which were now soft and rotting from soaking up years of meat juice and everything else. While inspecting a Chinese buffet, I noted to the employees that there were tubs of frozen fried shrimp stacked on top of one another without covers, so they needed to discard the top layers of the food and put on the tub lids. As they scrambled to do so, they knocked over the tower of shrimp, spilling it everywhere. As I was standing there, they hurriedly started scooping the shrimp off the floor and back into the tubs. "I'm standing right here, you guys!" A guy ordered commercial sausage-making equipment delivered to his private home. The manufacturer got suspicious and tipped off the health department. Turns out the guy would go hunting all sorts of exotic game meat without permits, process them into sausages in his rat-infested garage, droppings the size of jelly beans, and was selling them to the public. Don't buy food from home cooks, folks. Story 10. So a friend of mine is a health inspector. She walks into a local convenience store and discovers a litter box behind the counter. Totally unacceptable. Tells the proprietor that he needs to get rid of the litter box. That's kind of a health code violation. He replies, "Well, it's for the cat. We've been having mice-rat issues." To which she's all, "Oh." Cat walks up. She tells him he can't have a cat in a food establishment. He hands the cat to his wife, and she takes it out of the store to their camper trailer nearby the store. Waits for her to leave. Commenter: a long time ago while I was in college, I used to maintain aquariums. Quite a few were in restaurants. There was an old-school seafood restaurant that had a ton of tanks. Great customers, and a cool place. I would be out there at least once a week for half a day making everything spotless. This was before cell phones, you youngsters. I'm in class, and my pager, yes, pager, is blowing up from their number. I call and one of the Mexican staff picks up and all I could gather is, "Please, Mr. Fishman, you come now, very big problem emergency." I head out there and there are health inspectors there. So for all the tanks I take care of if a fish dies, I ask the owner to put it in a bag and freeze it so I can take a look and see if I can figure out why it kicked the bucket. Well, one of their very old and very large and pretty beat-up blue tangs, Dory, had died and they had frozen it per instructions. The inspectors show up to this seafood restaurant and first thing they see is this decrepit old fish that had been munched on by the other fish in the tank alongside the catch of the day. It was before opening, and only the Mexican staff were there who had no idea how to explain it. I got it sorted out, but kind of funny. Story 11. Used to have a job working as an inspector for storage tanks at places like dairies and factories. Went to a cheesecake factory once to test a milk storage tank. It had just been cleaned and was being prepped to be filled with a tanker full of milk. I noticed the floor of the tank was covered in bleach. It turned out the floor manager couldn't be arked to spend the time sucking out the rest of the cleaning fluid used in the cleaning process and, as standard, just filled the tank with milk on top of a dozen gallons of bleach. His theory was that there was enough milk to dilute the bleach to acceptable consumption levels. I wrote a report, and he was promptly fired. My 12-gallon estimate is just that, an estimate. It was a huge milk storage silo, 40,000 LE arc, and roughly half an inch of the floor of the tank was covered in cleaning fluid. The dilutions we're talking about probably wouldn't have been harmful or even tasteable after being pasteurized and mixed with cheesecake ingredients, but that's also a guess. And it's also not the point. Commenter was a health inspector long ago, was at a Golden Corral going through the kitchen area. As I was squatting down to check a dishwasher, my foot broke through the tile floor and into a sewer pipe that ran underneath. Banana roaches come boiling out of the hole. Turns out the entire floor was rotten from a water leak in the sewer pipe. Best worst part? The general manager tried to fight me when I told them they had to close down until they fixed the open hole into a pipe full of banana roaches and waste. Story 12. Not a health inspector, but a Chinese buffet near me was closed down because it got a 0/5 in its inspection. I got food poisoning from there once. The staff just got up and left, locked the door, never went back. All the food was still out and everything. A week later, a man was walking his dog past, said Chinese buffet, and heard a loud buzzing noise. Looked through the window to see hundreds of thousands of flies that had taken over the building as their new home. Was so bad that Pizza Hut next door had to close too. Commenter? In the mid-'80s, I managed a pizza delivery store, and the health inspector came by kind of late and asked me to step outside. He started by apologizing, but it was his job to follow up when they have a specific complaint concerning food safety. But this one was odd. He proceeded to tell me a customer complained that while they were in the store, 2 male workers had sex on the counter and didn't even wash their hands. I very dryly responded that couldn't have happened as we always wash our hands after having sex on the cutting table. With a small grin, he said that's what he thought, and he appreciated our efforts. He was our inspector for several years after that. Story 13. Not a health inspector, but my mom used to work at this restaurant where the owner just did not give a crap. It was a Mexican restaurant, and my mom told me that once a lady came in asking for caldo de res, beef soup, but they didn't have any more meat, at least not the one used for that dish. They were about to let the lady know when the owner stepped up and told the lady that her food would be right out. The server and my mom were both confused as to what she was going to do. Well, this lady goes and literally digs through the ducking trash and pulls out some beef, some still with bone. She then ran it through water, cooked it, and served it to that poor lady. My mom says the lady was even sucking the bone and she almost felt sick watching. My mom quit that job soon after. The bone meat was not raw. It was left over from people who had ordered the same thing. They had almost ran out of that soup. All the meat was gone, so they thought they would not serve anymore. The owner grabbed the bone meat from the trash, rinsed it, and threw it back in what was left of the soup. Heated up for a bit and served it. Just thought I needed to clarify this. Commenter. Late to the party, but I used to work on my own as a baker in a supermarket, and the cleaners would come in at 10 p.m. at night when the last worker left, and he would be finished by 2 a.m. when I arrived. Well, one day, I was half an hour early, and I walked up to my department, and the cleaner was mopping the prep tables and the equipment with the same water he had used to clean the floor. I wish I was joking. To use the mop on the tables to begin with is stupid, but using he same water as well? Insane. I told his boss when he came in because I simply had to, and his face was a picture. He really didn't believe me until I got him to have a look on CCTV. Oh, I forgot. He wasn't supposed to even touch the machinery. That was my job. So he was dirtying my already clean equipment. Story 14. Here are a couple I remember from her days as a restaurant inspector for the state health department. 1. A complaint from a grocery store that the Chinese restaurant next door was raiding their dumpster each night and taking all the produce they could find. 2. Walking into another Chinese restaurant and seeing pigeons in a cage in the back room. Just regular city pigeons. Asking, "You're not serving these to the customers, are you?" And being told, No, those are just for us. I don't mean to disparage Chinese people by citing two incidents about Chinese restaurants, but the truth is that many Chinese people come to the US on a Sesquirt string budget and cut corners as much as they can. Plus, the standards of healthy food service are often very strange to them. Telling someone that they can't cut the lettuce for the salad bar with the same knife they just used to cut a raw chicken is like telling them they have to stand on their head before cooking something. They just don't get it. They always did it this way at home. Your body gets used to fighting off the bacteria you grow up with. People from the other side of the planet have bodies that can handle bacteria we aren't used to in the Midwest part of the US. But that's a very hard point to get across. Here's one more from another side of the economic spectrum. I have a friend who plays in a band which has some national recognition. I won't say anymore, but they've had a few top 10 hits. He told me once that his band was booked to play a very expensive corporate New Year's party for a very rich corporation. The party took place at a very swanky hotel in a big city. He and the band had to load in through the hotel restaurant kitchen. Unfortunately, the sewers had backed up, and the entire kitchen of this swanky hotel restaurant was ankle-deep in raw sewage. But there was no way, the hotel manager was going to go out into the party room and explain to a host of $1,000 a plate diners that the kitchen was closed on New Year's Eve, so the kitchen staff kept cooking and the waiters kept serving. They put on rubber boots before entering the sewer kitchen to grab the next plate. The moral of the story is that food service is all about the money first. Understandable, because if there's no money, there's no food service. But you are just as likely to get food poisoning at the most expensive restaurant in town as you are at some local hole in the wall. Sometimes more so because there's more money at stake. Commenter, not an inspector, but my SO told me about what happened at a popular seafood restaurant in my town. A guy working at the fry station had a magnetic kitchen timer above the fryer stuck to the hood vent above. One day, the timer fell into the hot grease. They managed to fish out the main plastic part, but the batteries were nowhere to be found. It was determined that the batteries must have disintegrated into the grease. Being a seafood restaurant in the South, half the menu is fried. The owner is too much of a skinflint to stop serving fried food and change out the grease during dinner rush. So, Westcourt Fair ate catfish that night, had it fried in a tangy alkaline grease. Story 15. Not a health inspector, but my mom told me this story some time ago. When she was in her early 20s, she had started working as a waitress for the restaurant in this big fancy hotel. Just a few days after she started working there, the hotel was hosting some big events, so there were a ton of super rich people staying there, and thus the restaurant was super busy. So my mom goes into the kitchen at one point and sees that one of the chefs is clearly sick. He's coughing and hacking, and continually wiping his runny nose on a handkerchief, right as he's making food. So my mom goes to her boss and is like, "Hey, this chef is sick. He can't be working right now. He's gonna make everyone sick." Her boss told her that the guy said he was fine and to not worried about it. So my mom goes to the sick guy and tells him that he has to leave to prevent the food from being contaminated. He told her that he tried to call in sick, but the boss told him that they were going to be too busy and they needed him, and if he didn't show up for work, he'd be fired. So my mom goes back to the boss and he admits that, yeah, he knew the guy was really sick, but he didn't care if everyone else got sick as long as they got through the event. My mom tells her boss that this is wrong and that he needs to send the guy home, take back everyone's food, refund their money, throw out all the food that may have been contaminated, close the place down, and clean it up. He simply laughs at her and tells her she's fired. So she went and did the logical thing. She walked out into the dining room, stood on top of a table, and shouted to everyone at the event that the boss forced a sick man to work today and all of their food was probably contaminated. There was practically a riot. Everyone crowded around and screamed at the boss, demanding their money back. In the end, the restaurant was temporarily closed. Everyone got their money back. The boss of the restaurant was fired by the owner of the hotel, and Mom got to keep her job. Story 16. Not a health inspector, but I used to be a busboy at a nice Italian restaurant in my hometown. We had problems with the Chinese place across the street because we found out that they had been taking the lettuce that we throw in the dumpster at the end of the night. Our manager used to stand outside and guard the dumpster so they wouldn't take our garbage. Another experience working at a local cafe. I was cutting up cheese from a walk-in fridge and I found a hole in the cardboard box that the cheese was kept in. Turned out it was from rats or mice, and they were eating the cheese. Told my manager about it, and he told me to cut around the bite marks and still use the cheese. Left that job shortly after. Story 17. Worked in a restaurant. Sitting in the office one day, I hear an awful squeaking, shrieking noise. Took me a little while to find the source. Source turned out to be a mouse, stuck in some old spilled pancake syrup under a storage shelf. Commenter. I once finished up a foodborne illness investigation, not finding much that could have caused the illness, and left. I parked my car on the other side of the street in full view of the restaurant I was just at. I watched the dishwasher come out the back door, light a cigarette, smoke for a minute, then hunch over and ducking puke all over the grass. Then he took another drag and went back inside. I have mild emetophobia, so I got a bit of a cold sweat, then ran across the street and basically dragged his ass outside. I've got a lot of stories, but that was the worst for me. Story 18. Not health inspector, but I worked as an assistant cook in a restaurant. 2 weeks into the job, I opened a cupboard to get a can of tomato sauce, and I see a huge-ass tarantula scuttling away behind the cans. I told the boss what I had seen, so that maybe we should get someone to deal with the huge-ass spider living in the kitchen. Boss turns to me and says, "I see you've met Eduardo. Just don't put your hand too close to him, and you'll be good." Later, another cook proceeded to explain to me the spider been living there for 2 years, and they allowed it because he kept rodents and roaches away. This is a true story. So no, every time that you think about swatting a spider, remember that there is a possibility that a friendly spider is guarding your favorite restaurant's food against nasty critters. Commenter. Not a good inspector, but once I ordered tacos from a high-end vegan restaurant in LA. When I bit into the taco, I felt immediately a hard chunk gently slice into the roof of my mouth. I pulled out a 1-inch shard of glass from my taco. Management said they accidentally broke a glass near the tacos and they thought they got all of it. They offered a new plate of free tacos, but I was like, my mouth is bleeding. Why would I want another taco? Story 19. When my son was 5 or so, we had a nanny who used to look after him, and she used to take him to a local pub where one of her friends worked. He got used to sitting at the bar, eating a packet of crisps, chips, and drinking a soda. I'm starting to realize, as I recount this, as it doesn't reflect too well on my parenting skills. Oh well, he's 17 now, so I guess it's too late for social services to come and take him away. Anyway, the nanny was great, no matter what you might say. The nanny and her friend were round the corner in the other bar, chatting away, when a couple of besuited gentlemen wandered into the bar. My son was laying a line of crisps along the bar, and one of the gents started talking to him. It's worth noting that the regulars in the bar were used to him being there, and often referred to him as the boss. They let him pour them drinks, and so on, ostensibly under the supervision of the bar staff. Needless to say, it's illegal for 5-year-olds to be employed as bar staff, even in the UK. "I'm in charge here. Would you like a drink?" offered my son, scooting around the back of the bar. "No, it's okay, thanks." "What are the crisps for?" "Oh, I'm feeding my friend," my son replied. "Really? Where's your friend?" "He lives in that little hole." My son pointed to a hole in the wall towards the end of the bar. "And sometimes he comes out and I feed him." On cue, a small mouse appeared out of the hole, ran along the bar, and started eating the crisps. The men were environmental health officers. The pub was shut down that week and never reopened. Luckily, they weren't police. Otherwise, the nanny's friend would have been in serious trouble. Story 20. Not me, my cousin. She was a health inspector for the city of Melbourne, Australia, many years ago. Her advice? Never eat at Chinatown? Dead fish floating in the tanks of seafood restaurants with barely alive fish in the same tanks. Slime and mold in said tanks. Rusty surfaces used as chopping boards and mold-covered wooden chopping boards. Raw meats prepared together with raw vegetables. The lady washing the dishes at the cash register was the same lady that cleaned the toilets and made the dumplings. She never washed her hands. It doesn't matter how much you pay. Whether you spent $200 on your meal or $20, they are all as filthy as each other. The most expensive and well-known were actually the worst offenders. Banana roaches. Banana roaches everywhere. There's no such thing as an expiry date. Sauces mask everything there is. A saying here, though, that many people are aware of. The nastier the place, the better the dumplings taste. Story 21. Former inspector here. I once discovered a rat infestation in the kitchen of a hospital. They asked me if I could prove my suspicions. I pointed out the numerous foodstuffs with one -2 inches circular holes chewed in them, but they didn't seem convinced. I showed them the trail of droppings and footprints coming and going from a hole in the floor drain, but they didn't seem convinced. I showed them the 3 dead rats I had discovered under and around equipment. I think they began to believe me at that point. Citations included rat infestation and absolutely deplorable cleaning practices. Commenter, not a health inspector, but I've seen some crap. The worst was a restaurant a friend took me to. He loved it and said it was on him, but goddamn if it wasn't the sketchiest joint. If he hadn't spent the whole trip talking about how he eats there twice a week and loved it so much, I probably would have left. The place was disgusting. Mold on the walls, dirty floors, piles of unwashed dishes on the customer tables, etc. When we left, I happened to notice the health inspection sign. They'd gotten a 36 100ths. I didn't even know it was possible to score that low and stay open. Story 22. Ah, yes. A specific restaurant that I came across comes to mind. Before I go on, let me say that there was nothing wrong with the food this restaurant was serving at all. It was the atrocious and criminal customer service that almost ended with me 6 feet under. As tradition in the health inspector business, I started off by ordering a bit of everything on the menu. Of course, this was mostly done to surprise the chef and to keep him on his toes. We had to make sure the ingredients being used were fresh and prepared in a clean manner. Anyways, after my first order, I was catered to as if I was a movie star. Of course, this was common behavior, as almost all restaurant owners make the waiters kiss up to you all in hopes of a better scoring. This particular restaurant, however, was a bit too eager and was nearly spoon-feeding me, but I thought nothing of it at the time, and after politely asking them to leave me alone to do my job, I began to indulge in some of the most flavorful food I have tasted to this day. Everything was cooked to perfection and the veggies fresh as ever. After having the food make love to my taste buds, I was nearly all done with my job and ready to give the restaurant a perfect score. However, there was one thing I hadn't tried on the menu. See, this restaurant was famous for having one of the best burgers around, and I of course had to indulge in it as a customer, not a health inspector. Of course I wasn't going to tell them this. I asked them to bring the burger, and they eagerly did so. This is where things get a bit nasty, though. The burger, as far as I could tell, seemed normal, and I was dying to give it a bite. So I took my time to make sure I was prepared to taste the famous burger that had been recommended to me so much throughout the years by my peers and colleagues in the health inspector industry. I guess I took too long to take a bite, and a fly flew right into the back of my mouth like a bullet. I began to choke loudly and quickly motioned to one of the waiters for a glass of water, but they simply just stood there watching me. I was confused and began to panic as I seemed to run out of air. My eyesight began to get cloudy and the room began to spin as I passed out. The next several hours are still a blur, and I only remember bits and pieces, but even then I'm still confused on what's actually true and what my brain has made up from the trauma. All I know is I later woke up in the restaurant muddy with several gashes on my head and 2 police officers. My tip for all health inspectors out there? Avoid the Krusty Krab. Story 23. Not a health inspector, but assistant manager at a restaurant for a year between university. I once saw my sous chef flick a fillet steak out of the pan, kick it back up with his foot, and land it back in the pan to continue cooking. He did this 3/4 times. I was watching on the CCTV trying not to laugh every time he celebrated each catch. Story 24. Not a health inspector, but I used to manage a well-known sandwich shop. One day, I discovered a huge colony of black Stachybotrys mold growing behind one of the walls. I mentioned it to my assistant manager, who told me that everyone knew it was there, and that the entire staff assumed that I also knew about it and was just keeping my mouth shut. I reported it to the district manager and the owner that day. They both told me that they knew for a fact that black mold was harmless, and that they weren't going to pay $3,000 to tear out the drywall and replace it. I was fired inside of a week. I reported them to the local health department, but by the time the health department got around to doing the inspection, they had already fixed the wall. Story 25. Not an inspector, but I worked at sushi and hibachi restaurant for about a year as a server, host, and deliver driver. This place had a ton of things that were certainly questionable, but a few of them ended up causing me to leave the place. In the dry storage area, they had cleaning chemicals directly above all of the Togo food packages and plasticware. In that same room, which was really big, I'd randomly see a sleeping bag and pillow tucked away every once in a while. It always stuck out, but I never really thought too much into until I went back to grab a bottle of wine, and sure enough had stepped on a sleeping woman. She started yelling, and I just ran out. My manager pulled me aside later, which I assume was going to be a conversation about keeping that hush-hush, but no. The dude offered me $25,000 to marry a Thai chick so she could get a green card. My response to him was my 2 weeks' notice. Story 26. When my dad was a teenager, he would go to a beach half an hour away with his mates, and on the way home, they would stop at a great pie place. It was well known, and Dad says they served the greatest pies ever. They got shut down after it got out. Their pies were full of tinned dog food. Story 27. Health inspectors. Do you ever fear being attacked by someone when you're writing up a bad report? Particularly a really bad one that would shut them down. You're essentially destroying their livelihood, and I'm sure some would take it a little far. I'm well aware that the problems a restaurant has is the owner's fault, and it's not the big bad health inspector. I suppose I was trying to put myself in the owner's cess courts. As an irrational owner, I'd likely see it as an attack on my livelihood. Story 28. On a plus note. I've been a chef for 17 years and haven't ever seen anything overly gross at a restaurant I've worked at. I've mostly done fine dining and high-end chains, though. Although traveling to other countries is a different matter. You may resume eating. I'm very aware of what the term chef actually means. That being said, I'm a chef at a rather large restaurant, and I have 60 cooks working for me who refer to me as chef without me asking them to. Story 29. I had a health inspector tell me this story. There was a family in which both the elderly mother and a handicapped sibling used wheelchairs. Another sibling lived in the house with them and did all the driving, etc. The health department got a phone call from the local wheelchair company. The brother stopped by and picked up a new, custom-built wheelchair for his sister and for his mother, and returned within about 30 minutes, saying that the sister's wheelchair hadn't been made to the right specifications. It was too small. After he left, The staff noticed several roaches on the chair, so the guy I met got a call. Apparently, it was summer, Midwest, both hot and humid, and the house was all locked up with no open windows for ventilation, curtains drawn, etc. The inspector entered the house and he said it was so stifling hot that he started to get dizzy and he thought hallucinate. He said that there was a sound like leaves rustling in the fall and the walls and floors were kind of vibrating. He then realized it was because they were literally covered in roaches. He immediately evacuated the 3 people living there, and the next day, they tented and sprayed the house. He went in a Tyvek suit and knee-high rubber boots, and said that the dead roaches were about 2.5 feet deep in most parts of the house. Story 30. I used to work next to a Chinese place that tenderized 20-pound roasts by repeatedly slamming it on the floor. The pizzeria I was working at the time was so dirty, the wife changed the baby inside your pizza box. At another pizzeria I worked at, I was washing dishes, and the manager came to me with a block of Swiss cheese. It was covered in mold, and he wanted me to scrub it out of the holes. Story 31. Pools that have absolutely no chlorine. Pedicure tubs, filters that have never been changed. All of their disinfectants were expired. A restaurant that refused to clean up pest feces, urine, refused to properly cool foods, and refused to properly reheat foods. The kitchen had exposed wood everywhere. Well, it would be exposed if there wasn't a thick layer of grease and no sanitizer. Story 32. Probably too late for this one. But 2 years ago, a colleague in my department under food safety went to inspect a Chinese in a local town. Everything was going okay as food hygiene inspections go for a better-than-average Chinese, until she went to inspect the space upstairs above the kitchen. Our policy is that where employees stay, if it's in the same building, that is part of the premises. When she went up, she found a large number of illegal immigrants staying there. The police were alerted, and the Chinese was closed down before reopening under another name, I think registered under the owner's wife's name. Another quick new premises inspection followed, and it got a hygiene rating of 4 out of 5, which for the type of premises is about as good as you'd expect, and it was left alone for 2 years. Fast forward to last week. Another colleague went to inspect the premises for their biannual routine inspection. You'll never guess what the police were called for again. Story 33. For as bad as some of these stories are, I hope people understand that people in restaurants do touch your food. There's nothing that you eat in a restaurant that hasn't been directly touched by somebody in the kitchen. Some of you may be thinking, well, why don't they all just wear latex gloves? Actually, there's a couple reasons, they break far too easily among others, that make it impractical. But most importantly, if you only wear gloves, then whatever it is that you think is on their hands is now just on their latex gloves. Compulsive hand washing, hairnets, and keeping the place properly cleaned is as much as anybody can reasonably expect. Incidentally, Applebee's has to be the cleanest place I ever worked at. If you were standing around, they'd hand you a toothbrush and tell you scrub the grout between the tiles. Every day was a good 2 hours of cleaning after the place closed. That's with a good head start. Story 34. Environmental health inspectors don't only cover restaurants. I inspect wells and septic systems. I see sewage every day. The worst thing I've seen are old men coming up to their door naked. And what makes it worse is that they knew what date and time I was stopping by. Story 35. Kind of the opposite, but my partner's home daycare was inspected once, routine check. No big deal. A day later, the fire marshal returned and informed her that out of all the daycares he had visited the previous day, our house was the only one he'd send his kids to. The fact that he felt compelled to drive out of his way just to come tell that boggles my mind. Story 36. Not a health inspector, but there's one story in Vegas my mom told me about. There's this one bar, brilliantly named The Bar, and it has been shut down multiple times. One time it was shut down for being infested with roaches and trying to hide it. One time it was shut down for simply never cleaning anything and having horrible hygiene overall. And more than once, it's been shut down for the bartenders doing weird stuff with the drinks. She never elaborated on that part, but from the tone of voice it sounded sexual. Then again, none of this is exactly too awful, right? Thing is, that isn't the crazy part. The crazy part is that it keeps ducking reopening because of popular demand. This place has had huge crowds for years, even though it sucks. And whenever it shuts down, everyone throws a huge ducking fit, and a couple months later it pops back up. And it's not even like the people are stupid and don't know it's a pigsty. They just simply don't care. Story 37. I'm not a health inspector, but I've worked in dozens of fast food restaurants in my teens and 20s to know a clean kitchen from a dirty one. I worked for a company that made take and bake Chicago-style vegan pizzas in Seattle. Having worked for many fast food restaurants, I was shocked at the following. No ventilation, pre-cooked pizza crust in large walk-in ovens. But the ventilation fan above it never worked, so a few times a month, people who go home early from breathing in too much exhaust. No smoke detectors, fire extinguishers anywhere. When a small fire did break out, first words from the boss were, "Why did you call the fire department?" None of the food, be it canned or perishable, was ever dated when it arrived. The dough roller was cleaned only once a month and only by a professional. Working at Pizza Hut, they cleaned it twice a day. Got an oral warning when I took it apart and cleaned with mineral oil I brought with me. Out of a staff of 10 people, me and another worker were the only ones with food handlers' permits. Driver who delivered the pizzas to QFC and Safeway stores had no valid license. Hippie employees built a compost pile for waste, which attracted rats, and when it rained, juices flowed down and under the outdoor walk-in fridge, propped up with cement blocks, creating a cesspool for insects. Hand-washing sink was falling off the wall. Paper towel rack was basically a coat hanger nailed to the wall. On storage racks, chemicals stored above canned and perishable food. Cat living in the kitchen, to deal with the rats attracted by the compost pile. Employees dropping pre-cooked crusts on the floor, dusting it off and using them. Never cleaning the food slicer after slicing up buckets of green peppers, onions, or mushrooms. They had 3 sinks for wash, rinse, and sanitize, but all they did was wash and rinse. When I showed them that they needed to fill that last sink with lukewarm water and half a cap of bleach, they often filled it with hot water, thus making the bleach evaporate quickly and defeat its purpose. When I left that job, I reported them to the health board. Story 38. Not a health inspector, but there's a big Kebby Levy in my city right now. Because the local Cheddar's just got shut down for temporary emergency maintenance because of crap. I've been in the restaurant industry for 10 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The video pans to the fryer, and there are 6 roaches straight up nom-nomming on a French fry like it's cool. Moldy vegetable bits all over the floor that never got swept up. I'll never eat there again, even after they reopen under new management. Story 39. Mom's an inspector. My favorite is the woman who bought a bulk bag of rice from China, starts working her way through it, and the rice starts tasting a little funky. Whatever, it's not too bad, and it was a great deal. Gets 3/4 of the way through the bag and finds a dead bird mummified in the rice. The strange taste was because the rice absorbed the bird juices and preserved the corpse. Grossest one is probably the fish place that caught fire but didn't burn down. Turns out public health and the fire department need to go in to condemn the place. Mom comes in with her hard hat and some bulk-ass boots, and the fire chief with her. The smell is horrible. Burnt rotted fish is probably what hell wishes it could smell like. Maggots everywhere. Fire chief bails in the first 5 minutes to go puke outside. Mom worked in a slaughterhouse and is metal AF. She just mouth breathes her way through it. Then she starts hearing little plinking noises and feeling impacts on her helmet. It was ducking maggots on the ceiling falling on her. Place definitely got condemned. Most hilarious was probably a call that came through for a skunk bite. Turns out this toddler was at the grandparents' place on the back, raised patio. Sees a kitty and rushes towards it in excitement. Definitely not a kitty. Skunk sprays the kid full in the face. Kid is screaming, falls on the skunk. Skunk is freaking out and bites the kid. Grandparents are horrified and probably never allowed to babysit the kid again. Most upsetting are definitely the parents who won't let their kids get rabies vaccines. If you can't quarantine the animal or test the body, you can't know until it's too late. Story 40. Not a health inspector. Surprise, surprise. But there used to be a Chinese restaurant in the same area where I worked. About once a week, they would leave dead fish in the alley behind the store with flies crawling all over them. They weren't throwing the fish away, they were storing them back there until they could prep them. Story 41. My CNA instructor once witnessed a McDonald's employee, probably 16 or 17 years old, use a rag in the bathroom to clean the sink and anywhere else that needed wiping down. She later witnessed the employee later use the same rag to wipe down the counters in front of the cash registers. He was fired on the spot. Story 42. I used to work for a very anal and clean neat freak. Every ducking night we would scrub the entire restaurant floor with degreaser and mop over it. Take apart the Coke machine and soak all pieces in vinegar each night. Take apart the dishwasher and clean the parts by hand. Clean the baseboards, clean the windows, dust washed every bucket we kept extra food in. Scrubbed under railing, table, or any ledge, emptied the cooler, cleaned and refilled, cleaned the grill with sulfur, mopped the bathroom, scrubbed bathroom walls, sanitized every surface, washed the rags we used to clean, sweep the parking lot, sanitized the mops after mopping. Once a month, we would be called in on Sunday and we would get up on display ledges, take down decorations, big ones like furniture, dust it, sweep the ledges, scrub every inch of the walls, take apart and clean all appliances and tables for good cleaning. As an employee, it added an hour and a half to closing and really sucked. But by far the cleanest establishment I've ever seen, and I will continue to give them my business. The restaurant is called Neighbor's Mill in Harrison, Arkansas. They also newly opened one in Springfield, Missouri, and rumor is they are starting chains. I highly recommend it. They bake their own bread fresh every morning beginning at 3 a.m. Story 43, not me, but I remember seeing a news outlet. Hopefully someone can find and link it. A girl was working at this Mexican restaurant that gave complimentary chips and salsa, which weren't always finished, so the owner had the workers reuse the uneaten chips and serve them to other customers. Girl tells parents who confronts the owner about it, hopefully not having to go to the media legal. Owner pretty much tells them to shove it and that it's none of their business. The girl's parents go to the media and the place is shortly shut down. Story 44. I'm a health inspector. Actually shut down a restaurant today for failing their inspection. The following are several things I've seen fairly recently at different places, mostly Asian or Indian places. 1. Vent hood so dirty and clogged grease was dripping into the food, today's restaurant. 2. Moldy food on the cook line about to be served, today's restaurant. 3. A dead banana roach in the raw shrimp bucket on the cook line. When I pointed it out, the cook fished out the roach with his finger, threw it away, and proceeded to throw some shrimp on the grill like nothing was wrong. 4. A restaurant so infested with roaches, the roaches were crawling over the prepared food and the waitstaff were just flicking them off, then bringing the plates to the customers. 5. Walked in to do an inspection, and a guy had been living in the restaurant under a table. He had a sleeping bag, all of his life accessories. He was smoking cigarettes, eating all of his food, etc. under the prep table. A faux restaurant had a giant pot of soup that was room temp, and they just threw whatever meat and veggies and whatever else they didn't use that day into the pot and left it out overnight. This was their base for the faux. The next day, I've only been doing this 4 years, and I have hundreds of stories, but enjoy these few. Story 45. I was a quality assurance operative for a major UK chicken factory. One part of my job involved making sure birds were the right temperature before going on the production line, making sure they were fresh according to the spec for each customer, Tesco, Sainsbury's, KFC, etc. Birds were always 10 or 11 degrees centigrade before they even got on the line. Meat that was too old was used. Managers wanted to rush orders out, so they asked you to run around the factory and get a fresh kill label so that meat could be used, i.e. customers thought they were getting fresh meat, but in actual fact it was 4 or 5 days old. Birds were brought in for KFC orders that still had guts inside and were half cleaned and sent out for chicken on the bone. Most chicken portions were bruised black. There was green bile inside most birds that always got sent out. A mouse was inside a set of scales that was kept quiet. The scales were cleaned and production kept going, instead of all products being brought back and dumped. Nothing was metal detected, and any pack that the metal detector rejected was sent on anyway. M&S visited for an audit. They showed up early and found dirty machines, mouse droppings, and even a mouse ran over one of the auditor's welly boots. The place is a death trap. It should be shut down. Story 46. Obligatory, not a health inspector, but you know how sometimes gas stations will also have chain restaurants attached? Well, I stopped at one during a road trip because I needed gas. So this was a pretty small station that had somehow managed to fit a Subway and a pizza station inside. I had decided to pay inside so I could use cash, and while I was waiting in line, I smelled that fresh Subway bread and thought I might have to grab a sandwich too. Then I looked down. There, right by my foot, was an enormous banana roach, just doing its little banana roach things like hanging out, then flitting away, then peeking its gross head out from under the shelf. This was in the middle of the day, broad daylight with a bunch of people around. They say if you see a banana roach out during the day, the infestation is bad. The fact that it was acting so casual around a bunch of huge humans was also super concerning. I didn't get the sandwich. Story 47. If I can add a happy violation. There used to be a restaurant here called the Motorant, which was literally a restaurant built around an RV trailer that doubled as part of the dining room, built around it so that every winter they could just drive away and return in spring. So while there was quite a few ways we knew from the start the place was failing health codes, the biggest one was the 3 fat, happy, purring cats that had the run of the dining room, including cat beds and towers. Huge violation of health code, but clearly they gave no craps. So I and 2 friends show up, order burgers, sit down, and the cats all wander into our laps and begin purring up a storm while we talked and ate. We tipped extra. Story 48. Taking 10 years as an inspector. Most dangerous is usually not the most disgusting. I've seen entire walk-in coolers they were using at 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the staff didn't even notice anything wrong. I've seen piles of mice that died getting stuck in the grease behind the fryer. I've seen staff throwing raw burgers within the grill, then making a salad right after. I've seen squirrels and birds roaming freely inside a bread manufacturer. The stereotypes are true. Chinese restaurant kitchens are almost always filthy. Most common critical violation: dish machine not sanitizing properly. Story 49. Not a health inspector myself, but I got a story. I used to work in a deli at an Italian supermarket in New York. We used to cut everything from specialty Italian meats to all of your favorite boar's head cuts. Occasionally, someone would drop a huge, barely cut turkey or prosciutto. We were basically trained to act like we were going to throw it out. The customers could clearly see we dropped the meat. We had very low counters. We would take it into the back room, put it on a table, then go open a new one and finish that person's order. After the order, we would just run the turkey under a faucet and say, "Good as new." The floors were disgusting. The floor was just filled with meat cheese throughout the day, and the dirt germs for everyone's escorts. We would do a quick 10 minutes mop at the end of the night. Of course, we had roach problems. Funny also, the pest control people would come like once a month in disguise as fire safety inspectors during closing hours of non-busy days. Food for thought. Story 50? Not a health inspector, but witnessed some things at my first job as set-up waitress at a banquet hall. The head cook had some hairy arms, and he always mixed the salad with his hands, so you know that hair is getting in here, and one day we found a used Band-Aid in the salad. I survived the assassination attempt. Story 51. Mom worked for a hospital. Case after case of food poisoning came in, with one thing in common. A local restaurant had a lobster dinner special. Health inspectors went in and found that they were dumping the half-used clarified butter back in the pot in the serving area as they cleared the tables. Story 52. Not a health inspector, but used to work in a pub restaurant. We used to serve sauces, like ketchup, French mustard, in little ramekins, rather than allow people to choose how much they wanted from the bottle. The ramekins were never cleaned or the sauces emptied. We were told just to fill them up on top of the old sauce. I was only about 15 at the time, but remember thinking it was disgusting. People would lick tomato ketchup spoons and put them back in the pot, and we'd just fill it up. The French mustard at the bottom of the pots was hard and black. Maybe I'm oversensitive. Story 53. I'm not one, but I've seen some crap. Just a couple months ago, our town had decided to post the low-scoring restaurants on the front of the papers. They were organized in colors. So like yellow and mild, blue was bad, and red was just nope. Our rival restaurant serves similar food and is 5 minutes away. Got a 70 red point violation. Story 54. Not a health inspector, but I was visiting a friend in Colorado, and his roommate came home from a taco place in Denver. He unwrapped a napkin to show us a tooth that was in his taco. The guy still ate all of his tacos, even after nearly swallowing a tooth. We tried to tell him he should have made a complaint, but he was so nonchalant about it. Story 55. A restaurateur was trying to reopen a failed one into a new one. It had been a Mexican joint. It was going to be a deli. I was working for a pest control company, and they called us to take care of a few bugs. No big deal. They're just proactive. I get there. It's clean. It smells okay, but I'm about 1 month into this new job and experience. I go to get started, and I'm mixing up the crap we have to use in restaurants, and I'm using the water from one of their triple sinks. The water is coming out hot. It's a Vegas summer, so I'm letting it run until it cools down some. I look over at the floor sink the triple sink drains into, and there's a lot of German banana roaches coming out of it. Damn it, this water will do. I fill up the 2 gallons, put the pump handle back in and shake it to mix it, pump it to pressure, and get to work. When you start with a full canister, there's less air, so you have to stop and pause to repump it to keep the pressure up. As I'm going, hitting all the cracks and crevices behind the sinks, the equipment, under everything, the seam and the wiped-down plastic walls, etc., roaches are just pouring out into the open. It's in the thousands stage, where now when I stand still, they are trying to hide under my boots. The last time I have to stop to pump up the canister, I'm standing on its stainless steel with the brass handle between my feet. Damn this. I call on the radio for a coworker who I know is nearby because he has a fog unit and I don't at this point, newly hired, wasn't 100% kitted out. Tony swings by. I'm waiting outside and we renegotiate the service. The new owner had been a little on the light side with the depth of his problem. He agrees. We get to fogging. Tony's showing me how to do it, so I'm just walking behind him. At this point, there's tens of thousands of roaches everywhere. Floor, walls, ceiling. We got to the walk-in and above it where I think the compressor was a 4-foot H by 8 foot by 10 foot space. Tony directs the fog stream up in there and the roaches start pouring out. Pouring out in such numbers that briefly, you can barely see the stainless steel of the walk-in door. The entire rest of the day, any little itch on my skin, you're leaping to slap it and check it's not a roach stuck on you. Story 56. In NSW, Australia, we have this website called Name and Shame. It's official, and it lists the restaurants and takeaway shops that have been issued fines and what they got in trouble for. It's pretty great. I wish every state and country would do this as well. Story 57. Not a health inspector, but I repair cooking equipment. Walk into a job at Chinese restaurant. The cook is sitting on the toilet taking a dump in full view of the world while shelling peas. Story 58. Received complaint about Chinese restaurant that served a lady a fully cooked mouse in her takeout container. I was pretty skeptical at first after she told me over the phone. She froze the container and brought it into our office. Somehow they did not notice that a mouse fell into the fryer while they were cooking and proceeded to box it up. Story 59. It's not as crazy as some of the stuff mentioned here, but a friend of mine who is a health inspector was telling me he awarded his first 0 recently. We have a 5-star rating here. The violation? The place didn't have a sink. Not even a lack of washing hands, just straight up didn't have a sink. Story 60. My buddy quit a job at a big chain restaurant because he was a dishwasher, and when he drained the sink at the end of his shift, there was a full chicken breast. His manager told him to wash it off and put it in the fridge. He threw it out, got in an argument with the manager and quit. Said he would never eat at that place again. Then it mysteriously shut down a couple months later. Story 61. Not a health inspector, but I used to work at a quick-serve restaurant with a girl who smelled and looked like she never showered, and proceeded to not wear gloves while prepping food. She had the nastiest fingernails and would stick her finger into taste, and put her licked finger back into whatever she was making. Story 62. Worked at a restaurant and the chef would smoke inside the kitchen, and I have seen him accidentally ash in the mashed potatoes and just stir it around a little bit more. I ate once at the restaurant and got food poisoning, so even though I got free food working there, I would still bring food from home. Besides, everyone was a smoker there, and no cleaning hands before touching the food. Story 63. An employee at a strip mall was having a cigarette break and filmed a Chinese buffet worker stomping and crushing garlic in a pail with ratty Nikes on. The restaurant closed after the video was posted. Story 64. I work produce in a grocery store. My team never culls the bad apples and just likes to put the new ones on top of the old. Imagine grabbing an apple expecting normal apple and then having your fingers sink into mold. Story 65. I worked in the deli of a convenience store for nearly 15 years. It was a constant struggle to explain to my boss how I couldn't save the leftover chicken and veggies and sell them the next morning. My customers were happy to pay more, knowing the food was always fresh. 6 months ago, boss decided to lease out the kitchen and move me to the main store. Ex-customers keep coming to me to complain about the food tasting bad and making them sick. So I went back to check and counted about 6 violations that would get them shut down or fined. Clorox bleach stored on the floor next to chicken breading, defrosting meat stored above the vegetables, it drips down onto the veggies, and at the end of the day, the cook takes all the food trays and puts them, uncovered, into the fridge to sell the next day without letting them at least cool down. It smells like rotting food back there since they never clean out the drains. I've also seen her cutting uncooked meat with a machete on the bare floor, and she never ices down the raw chicken at the end of the day, so it starts to stink by mid-week.